Hi, how's it going? I am just setting this video up to do the second episode um, of my live streaming. I am gonna wait for a few minutes to sort of see how people get along with coming in and joining. Um, I have a bunch of very, very cool things to talk to you about today. Um, I really, really enjoyed doing last week's talk. I felt really, really great after it, and it was exciting to be able to connect with uh, everybody again, essentially. It's a big chunk of my life sort of explaining and um, and connecting with people about the perfume that I make. It takes a long time to figure out how to talk about some of this stuff, but it clarifies a lot of things for me. Um, and hi, Toby. Hi, Brittany. Thanks for joining, guys. I'm just sort of waiting for the first couple of minutes, and then we'll start to give people a bit of a chance to join on. I'm going to try and talk for about as long as I talked for last week. Um, I I don't really come with a clear plan of what I'm going to talk about, but I think I've written a few dot points and following on sort of last week, and I thought it would be good um, to sort of just see how things go and have a bit of a stream of consciousness happening as well. I think it's better to do a bit of a talk and a bit of a presentation that involves um, me understanding and discovering and exploring things as sort of during the process of talking to you guys live, rather than coming with a really strict structure and um, and sort of professing um, the ideas that I've knuckled down. I think it's better to sort of explore things on the spot. All of these videos as well are going to be uploaded to the Sonic Alchemy YouTube channel as well. So I'm going to try and do these sort of knowing that people might watch them later on. It'll be great to have a little bit of footage of me explaining some ideas for people to come and who want a bit of a behind the scene sort of preview to some of my work. So following on from last week, I thought it would be really, really fun um, to do another little bit of reading to start. I think that's a really nice way to start things off. This book is, if you can see it here, there we go. It's called The Blood of Roses. It's got a very intense cover that I really like. A tree with lots of eyes and everything. And this book is what my perfume Anskarad from last summer. It's my most recent work. This book is essentially what the perfume is based on. There are definitely a lot of other things that I worked on it from. I worked on Anskarad from like February to December of last year, so there were a lot of things. But this book, which is a sort of a really massive, like 800-word fantasy fiction novel with some really interesting ideas in it, helped me to sculpt the emotion of the perfume because it's quite a complicated scent with lots of different contrasting oils that don't tend to be put together. And the book helped me kind of get that sense of a world that's now gone, and a sense of sort of dirty grittiness. So I'm just going to read about a page from this, because it's quite a lovely little bit. Okie doke. From the first seed, which fell like a burning moment of time into the soil, into the hot soil of the beginning, the forest was. Long before it became shadow and substance and covered over the land, it was a condition of the land. In the earliest days, when men made their way between the slender stalks of it, its bones no wider than sticks, they spoke of it as the great wood. It breathed with wings, wove like a spider, a tangle of undergrowth, gave birth out of its loom, was a hive of hidden life. And when the forest had grown tall, dense, and constant, so that trees might fall and not be numbered, the soul of the forest was strong enough that what passed through it or took refuge in it made offering. At first the offerings had been random. What died there left its decay, its skeleton, its cooling blood. Trees grew from the spines of forests. Trees grew from the spines of foxes. Out of the dead cups of human skulls, the pines went up. It began to be that these gifts of building were anticipated, as though the trees had whispered of a need. There were those who lived from start to finish in the great wood, never saw another place, and disbelieved what they heard. Was not the world one whole forest, perhaps split here and there by waters, and yet the trees grew in the waters too, and only mountains lifted, and the mountains were clothed in the forest. The forest was mother and father, womb and grave, living and extinction. They worshipped the forest, for being all things, the forest was also God. So that's that little section. Thought it would be cool to read from again. The book again is called The Blood of Roses, and it's sort of emotional impetus for my last perfume called Anskarad, which I'll talk about probably maybe next week or the week after. So that was really an intense section, but I love the idea of how ancient forests are, and I was watching a number of nature documentaries recently, and I was learning about the boreal forest, which is the largest forest in the world, which formed when Northern America and Central Asia were the same continent. And it's sort of now where the last living Siberian tigers live. And so I seem to be becoming more obsessed with forests and the things we learn from nature, and sort of ancient myth and ancient beauty, more so than focusing in on the last 150 years or that kind of thing. Getting less interested in modernity and more interested in animism and ancient ritual. So that was a really cool little bit. I really liked that. It sort of shook me in a nice way. So if there are any questions through any of what we're going to be talking about today, feel free to just post them in the comments, and I can answer them sort of as we go along. That would be really good as well, because we can kind of tailor the talk to what you guys are interested in. Today I'm going to talk about sort of two things. The first is I'm going to give a really good go at explaining how I got into scent. It's probably the biggest question and the most common question that I get asked whenever I meet anyone. And it's always a little bit tough for me to answer it because usually it's being asked at markets where it's a busy sort of public place and there isn't much time to go into it. So I usually give a really small and sort of not particularly concise version of how this happened. It's a little bit of an unusual thing to do as a sort of lifelong pursuit, particularly in this part of the world. So I'm going to try and talk a little bit about from when I started really to now, and give a bit of a run through about that. Then I'll talk a bit about my creative process, focusing in on a perfume that I made called Blue In Monolithic. It's part of the Rothko series, which I mentioned briefly last week, but I'm going to explain a bit about that perfume, and I'll talk a bit about the painting that Blue In Monolithic is based on, and we'll talk a bit about synesthesia, which is how I've made most of the Rothko series, involving sort of combining impressions of color with impressions of olfactory information and blending color and smell together, which is something that I'm really passionate about and that I think is kind of the crux of creative perfumery in a way, or at least one of the cruxes. And I'll show you sort of a couple things that are in Blue In Monolithic, and that'll be sort of most of what today will be like. So starting with this, I'm going to talk a bit about the very beginning. So when I was 14, I had my first really, really bad flu. I think everyone at a different age comes to a point where they realize how, sort of as an adolescent, how horrifyingly intense it is to be sick. My mum's favorite book at the time was a novel called Perfume by Patrick Suskind. It was written in the 80s, I think. It's the only real perfume book, sort of perfume novel, that's become really, really part of popular culture, I'd say. And it was made into a movie not that long ago featuring Dustin Hoffman, and she had brought the back when Video Easy was still a thing, she had rented the video of Perfume, the adaptation of the book, and that was kind of the ritual when I got sick. I think everyone had that when they were kids. They would only thing you could really do was watch as much television as possible and try and forget how sick you were. And so this was when I was 14, and I watched the film Perfume, which if any of you guys haven't seen it yet, I'd really recommend watching it. It's hauntingly beautiful and very supernatural and interesting, and parts of it are very accurate to. I mean, it's a bit of a murder story. The center guy, I won't spoil it, but the central guy is crazy and quite murderous. But the bits involving Perfume are, for that to hit the sort of neocortex of a 14-year-old when they're sick was really, really intense. They speak about sort of perfumery rituals in ancient Egypt, and it's this big emotional and ancient thing in the movie. And I, needless to say, was completely baffled by it and kind of frightened by it and intrigued, and I had never really thought of perfume existing as a thing before that, really. And it really shook me up. So I remember sort of turning to my mum and asking if we could do that, if I could actually somehow pursue parts of it as a real thing, because it wasn't really a part of the landscape that I grew up in to have that kind of exposure. So we essentially just started going kind of crazy with it. And I remember I would go and with old sort of shopping bags, and would just shovel in any flower that I could find. And I remember sitting on the ground in front of the quince bushes as they would fruit, and just baffling at how some of these things were smelling. I had a lot of help from mum, obviously, because I had no idea how to kind of conceptualize what it meant to take a flower and bring out its scent into a bottle. It's a really intense idea for a kid. And we had this jasmine vine. I think it was the first ever time I really smelled jasmine in my life, that was wrapped around the handrail of the stairs at the front of our house, and it would bloom right at the sort of that first initial heat wave of summer, and these beautiful pinkish white jasmine blossoms would be hit by the sun, and you would just get this kind of the occurrence of something has arrived, and it's a powerful thing. And so we would pick these flowers by hand, and we'd use this old technique that wasn't done. We didn't do it right, but we would do this old technique that was developed in ancient Egypt called enfleurage, where you would pick individual blossoms and place them on Pyrex glass that's been coated with lard, and then you would put individual rows of these blossoms in this lard, and every day you would replace the flowers with new flowers until the fat is coated in what's called the essential oils of the flower. It's an ancient technique. It's not used a whole lot now. For obvious reasons, it takes a long time and it's very intense. But I was sort of exploring these different ideas of scent, and of how potentially someone at the age of 14 could make a perfume. So something that I did at that point in my life was, at the school I went to, we used to have to do these personal projects. I have my actual personal project here. For anyone who's ever gone to my high school, Talopia High, this will be a real nostalgia hit. So it just says, personal project, final report, the manufacture and creation of a perfume. So this was sort of a project that everyone, at the end of year 9, I think you start your personal projects, and it's like a year-long thing that helps you, I guess, helps to finalize your time at high school, and I think it used to count quite a lot towards you getting your year 10 certificate. Anyway, I chose, obviously, to make a perfume, and I haven't looked through this in honestly probably 10 years, but it's got all these lovely, if I can sort of show you, all these amazing pictures of flowers that I tried to extract the scent of. Most of them, although the writing's too small to really show you guys, most of them at the bottom of it says, this experiment did not work. I could not use this flower essence. I was extracting a lot of oils back then with by literally getting like flower sieves and shoving olive oil in them, and then pressing the flowers down in the oil, which just made a really sickly sweet smell of olive oil. So all my perfumes back then mostly just stink of oil. And so then there's some stuff here about some stuff here about distillation, which I can talk about a bit, but it's sort of technical, and I don't know if you guys can see that here. This is sort of an example of, if I can see, wait, here we go, yeah. Sort of examples of scent extraction, and to your right is a little bit of example of distillation. So I was sort of trying to learn how to do that. That's sort of when I made my first fragrance. I actually think I ended up delivering it to the school, and I think they might still have it somewhere. If anyone from Talopa is watching, I'd like my perfume back. I don't know where it is, but I don't think it was particularly good. I think I made a couple different ones, and some of them smelled very confusing. But I kind of was always playing around with it. At that point, I had this old box full of styrofoam, cutout bits of styrofoam with all these little essences that I had. A lot of them that I had sort of inherited from my mum, that were sort of just loose musk, sort of rose fragrances that I used to play around with a lot. And another thing I used to do as well is, I remember in English in Year 9, we would study the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe. And I remember having a creative response due for that class, where I wrote out the creative response for the like poems or stories we were studying, and then next to it I had actually like created a perfume for the that's my cat. I had created a perfume for the story, like interpreting some of these stories, which makes a lot of sense now, sort of contrasting that with some of the work I do now. It was a really interesting thing. I ended up giving it up sort of in Year 10 when I was 15 to music, because I was really into beatboxing and into live looping. I then got into DJing and electronic music, which I did sort of Year 11 and 12, and continued on to do that later on as well. And then, interestingly enough, I think I was 20, and we were visiting, a group of friends of mine were visiting Melbourne. It was the first time I'd ever been to Melbourne as a young adult. And so, actually, yeah, I think it was around then. I remember specifically, I went on a walk one morning, and I had, the night before, I had painted my whole body blue for some party, I think. I dressed up as a Smurf. Anyway, needless to say, the next morning I was still completely blue. And I went walking and I got lost, and I found this little bookstore, and I sort of said, wow, this is really, really interesting and curious. And so I went and sort of browsed around. I didn't really read at all back then. I learned how to read very late, and so it wasn't a thing that I did for fun. But I went into this bookstore, and the first book that I took out from the shelf, was this book called Perfume's The Guide, written by Luca Turin and his then partner, Tanya Sanchez. And this is largely a book that is sort of reviewing and describing some of the most sort of popular or cutting edge scents of the last decade or so. If you're ever interested in Luca Turin, he's got some really good YouTube videos where he talks about sort of the alchemy of scent and the chemistry of beautiful smells and that kind of thing. It's really great to watch. I remember watching some of that as well when I just started, and it really sort of blew me away. The thing that really was interesting about this book was I hopped back on the plane to go back to Sydney, where I was living at the time, with this book in my hands as I was as we were taking off, and I was reading. There's like a little bit of a section, sort of a 10-page section here, which is just talking about sort of the world of scent before he starts reviewing the perfumes. And it was absolutely amazing to read. Kind of awoke a different kind of creative drive in me, I think. I kind of fell back into the perfume thing when I never in 100 years expected that I would. And it became a kind of special thing at the end of the day. After uni, I would read a few pages of this, and something was sort of happening inside me that was frankly incredibly mystical and interesting and hard to describe at the time, because at that point in my life, perfume had been this thing that I played with essentially as a kid. And I was going into my last year of uni, so it was sort of a bit of a weird turn of events. Like, what do you mean you're getting back into perfume and you've just rented or taken out all these books about perfume? You're studying music now, and it was, I think, a very challenging thing for me to get my head around, and hard for some of the people around me as well to try and get that down. But it just sort of happened, and I from there found the old box of essences that I mentioned earlier that I had 6-7 years earlier when I was like 13, 14. Dug them out of my mum's garage and started to, I couldn't believe that they were all still there, and I started to play around. And when I finished my second year of uni, I went to I was going to UTS at the time. I went to the university library and I took out every single book on that just mentioned the word scent or perfume. I took out the Journal of Marie Antoinette's Perfumer in the 1700s. I took out a book about poisons and perfumes and floral chemistry and anything. I read it like mad. It was a really intense time for that kind of thing for me, and I think I ended up not going back to uni after that, because I was so taken away by what scent could mean, how new it felt for me, how kind of it felt a little bit like becoming whole again, or becoming a kid again. I think there's a lot of pure play in perfume and in scent and in smelling things and in being really curious. So anyhow, I ended up moving back to Canberra, where I now live, and I started to just research like mad. And I bought more books, and I bought more essential oils and scented things to play around with. And from there, I knew that I needed to go and study scent somewhere. I needed to go and study perfumery somehow. And perfume, for anyone who's interested, is a very, very hard thing to go and go to school with. Some people, it's just one of those things for some reason in this part of the world that hasn't developed yet. I'm hoping to, throughout my life, play a part in bringing it to Australia as an educational pathway, because one of the reasons why I stopped when I was so young was I realized I would have to move away to study something like that, and I don't think I was quite prepared to. I identify a lot with this country and this city, and my work does as well, obviously. So from there, I found out somehow about this school called Perfumers World, and I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. And at the time, I was desperately trying to learn more than what you can find out by reading a random person's subjective article. I wanted to hear a bit more about how professionals did it in the real world. It's become really interesting with the internet and perfume. There's so much out there, but it's quite hard to decipher. And if you end up where I was going through all these blogs and these forums, a lot of it is secondhand knowledge, and it's not what I was after. It's great for people who just kind of, for novices and people who want to really just kind of get a bit of a grip with the basics and want to have something that's, bottled. But I wanted to learn, I wanted to become a professional, I think, even back then. And I ended up looking up Perfumer's World, and they had under their YouTube account all of these filmed classes that they had done, and I couldn't believe how much knowledge was in just a 5-minute clip. One of the reasons for this is that perfume as an industry is really, really secretive, and a lot of the sort of the big boys in the industry are really protective about knowledge, and really only in the last 10 to 20 years has this thing called open sourcing your knowledge and your creative understanding in the field of perfumery become any kind of real thing. And so I was blown away, and I wanted to figure out how to contact them and figure out how to study there. One of the things as well is that so many of the perfume courses are taught in French or Italian, and this was in English. Perfumer's World was set up originally by a guy called Stephen Downthwaite, who was a British fellow, and he noticed that there was no sort of educational tool that was user-friendly in the perfume world, particularly none in Asia. So he set up a school in Bangkok, and I thought, well, that's a hell of a lot closer than going to France or America or Italy to try and learn these things. And so nevertheless, I booked in, and I went in over there for about a month, a little less, and I did a course over there where I made my perfume especial, which is a Portuguese word, and that was the first time I had ever combined music and scent. It was a really pivotal experience for me because I got to sort of there were about 30 people in the class, and then there was 2 weeks at the end of it with less than 10 people. So they were sort of split up. It was great to meet people who are passionate about smell and passionate about creativity, and to really get to learn a bit more about how to actually do this alone. It's a very hard art form to try and learn how to make by yourself. And so it was beautiful to learn the real foundational skills of perfume from them. Big shout out to them. If anyone's from Perfumer's World is watching, you guys are the absolute bee's knees. And I owe a lot to them. They've been very helpful because I am very, very curious and ask lots of questions. And so even 4 years after I went there, I still email and send them questions, and they answer virtually all of them, which is very, very lovely. And so that was in 2016. That was 4 years ago. I went over there. I came back, and my whole identity was very, very focused and different from how it was before. At that same time, I quit drinking and quit smoking, and it was a very intense, transformative process. Quite honestly, quite monastic as well, quite ascetic. And I came back and made sort of the first 4 perfumes that I then launched through Sonic Alchemy the year after that in 2017. And yeah, I guess that's sort of how it originally formed. I was only really playing with scent at the beginning because I was trying to see how I could use it as a performance art tool. Because during that year, before I went to perfumery school, I was actually putting on these shows that were multi-sensory DJ performances, where I would have, usually at that stage, I just had two sections, so like a 20-minute performance. 10 minutes was about India, and so I'd have a scent that I'd created about India, and then I would score that 10-minute section, and then the next would be about the ocean, and I would score that 10-minute section and make a perfume for that. So I was more using it as like an experimental performance tool, and that's kind of where the name Sonic Alchemy developed its roots. And yeah, I guess, and now in a few weeks, we'll be having the 3-year anniversary of Sonic Alchemy. So that's sort of a bit more of like a fleshed out example of like how I came about as a perfumer, and where the roots of what I do is sort of based. I just need to plug my computer in. It's about to die. The battery is not what it used to be. And so I'm going to leave that part of the talk there. I think I went into that for long enough. And yeah, if you have any comments or questions about that part, I'd be happy to answer them for sure. It is a bit of an interesting thing now, though, thinking back to the sort of roots of perfume for me, because it feels very much like a lifetime ago, and a very sort of as if it chose me as much as I chose it, which is not a very common way of looking at things for, I think, modern, like Western culture, but that's the best way I can explain it. So that's how I explain it. But nevertheless, very interesting. So I'm going to now talk a little bit about Blue In Monolithic. I really wanted to figure out a way to talk sort of clearly about my creative process, and I realized that I couldn't do that if I didn't have the context. So it's going to be sort of a killing two birds with one stone kind of thing. So I'll for the next few weeks, when I do these talks, I will bring up different projects and sort of fill in the different shades and parts of my creative process based on the actual perfumes I've made. I think it will be a little easier to understand. I worry about it being a bit abstract, so I'm going to make sure to do it with examples. And I'll also say that as I talk about Blue In Monolithic, I'm not going to be explaining anything from the formula. Or to put it in a different way, I'm not going to be referencing the formula. I am essentially going to be talking about it from pure memory, if that makes sense. So I'll be talking about the formula, but I won't be looking at it. It's going to be off the top of my head. I think a really cool thing to do if you're a perfume artist is to understand individual parts so that you understand the whole, and to understand the whole so that you understand individual parts. And one way you do that is by memorizing an entire perfume formula by heart. It is absurdly difficult to do, but I've managed to do it with Blue In Monolithic today, so that's exciting. What I'm going to do here is I've just posted a link. I've noticed that I think if you're on your phone and watching this, I don't know if you can click on the link and watch this at the same time, but that's cool. You'll know it's there if you want to check it out. for anyone who wants to check it out, I've just posted this link to the painting that Blue In Monolithic is based on. So the painting is called, it's by Mark Rothko. It's called Untitled Red, Blue, and Orange. It's like 65 years old now. And so I've posted that link down there for you guys. And I'm going to run through how I went about translating this. So this was the final perfume that I made in the Rothko series. And there's 3 perfumes. I'm going to talk about the other 2 next week. I was really obsessed with how to go from taking sort of audio visual and purely musical content and translating that into like an interpretive scent, and moving that into pure sort of visual art and painting and connecting that with the scent world seemed really, really important to me. I'm not sure why I chose Rothko. Again, maybe his work chose me. I'm not really why it caught my eye. I think it's his work. I think people respond to his work in the most emotionally pure kind of way that I've ever seen. Some people don't like his stuff, which makes a lot of sense because it makes you work a little bit. But I really like his approach to color has been really important to me. And I knew that blending color and scent together was going to be really challenging. So I needed to have someone who was based in a kind of, who was unique enough in the way they used color, essentially, I guess I'll just say. And so basically, another thing I'll talk about is that the creative process of like a perfumer as well is quite non-linear. So I'm sort of more talking about looking back on this project rather than talking about how I was feeling at the time. I don't really make a work and then sort of and record how I'm thinking at the time. It's more of an intuitive internal process. So I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about how I'll just look at the painting here. Yeah. So the heart of this perfume, which I will link the perfume description of at the end of the talk in maybe the comments, so you can click on my website, Etsy, online Etsy thing, and look into the actual perfume description, because I have about 200 or 300 words that I've written about this perfume, which is really good and can help. But so the sort of heart of this perfume, if you're looking at the actual painting, is this blue rectangle. Next week, when I talk about the other Rothkos, I'll bring a printout and have it as a physical form. But the sort of blue rectangle chunk of this painting is the real heart of Blue In Monolithic. I found myself at that time really obsessed with how the hell you made the color blue into a scent. It was very, very, very annoying and hard for me, because I thought initially that the only way you could do it was to go into that sort of like blueberry artificial smell, and that's not something I was particularly interested, I don't think, in. And a lot of my creative ideas present themselves as if they're kind of bugging me. And so when I was trying to figure out how to do this sort of blue note in this perfume, even when I go outside for a walk and I would look up at the sort of blue sheet of the sky, I would be reminded of how important it was to try and get this blue note. I seem to experience a lot of that, where I'll see a flower blooming that comes in at a certain time of the year, and I'll go, that's right, it's calling to me, and I need to figure out how to express it. And sometimes I never get it, but nevertheless, it keeps calling. And the blue heart note of this perfume, one of the reasons why I called the perfume Blue In Monolithic is that it literally has this kind of this structural center where you have a chunk, a big block, a monolith of blue scent, and around it I've sort of carved out pieces of that blue block and placed in different smells and different shapes. So one of the main things I'll also be talking about in regards to the Rothko series is its relationship with synesthesia, which I'll talk a lot about during these sorts of talk series. But my synesthesia works where I will smell an odor, a perfume ingredient, a whole perfume, it doesn't really matter, and I will experience literal, like, I will feel a color or a kind of holographic projection on the front of my brain telling me the color, which is why a lot of the times when I'm smelling things, my eyes are closed. Lots of people actually have synesthesia, lots with music and with people. Sometimes people have it with words. It's actually a lot more common than some people think. I think about 1 in 150 people have it full blown, so it's not actually that uncommon. A lot of people have it and they don't know they have it as well. I recommend having a good session on Google about that because it's really, really interesting, the relationship between synesthesia. And I can talk more about that later as well. But so I essentially went through more or less every single scent that I own and every single odor that I have in my perfume palette, the perfumer's palette, which is for me about 1,000 different smells. And I collected 5 key blue smells to me. And the biggest one for the heart note of this section, and really the heart of the perfume as a whole, is this oil here that I have, which I'm just gonna try and pipette some up for you guys. Blue Monolithic, I don't have a finished bottle here, but you can see photos on the link that I share later in the video. But Blue Monolithic is an actual blue perfume. Its perfume color, its physical color is literally blue. I don't know if you guys can see this. Yeah, it's sort of not a great angle, but I'll hold this up a little closer. Can you guys sort of see its color? Yeah. So it literally looks like pen ink, essentially. My sort of approach with this, it smells very interestingly like a herb mixed with eucalyptus, mixed with like something slightly fruity. Yeah, it has this really interesting, what I call pen ink odor. It's very, very interesting and nostalgically childlike as well. And so that's the key of the perfume, really. People call it German chamomile oil or blue chamomile oil. It sort of smells insanely different to any kind of chamomile that you would imagine. It's like a chamomile from outer space sort of thing. And so I combined this oil with geosmin, it sounds like jasmine, but geosmin, which sort of has this beetroot-like wet soil smell, with cyclamen, which is sort of a really beautiful floral scent, and I think another thing called hedione, which is like an isolate or a synthetic version of jasmine that's found in jasmine. And through blending those 5 things, and eucalyptus as well, I combined this eucalyptus that tends to be found in the Blue Mountains. So again, it's like this layering of blue effect. Combine those sort of 5 together, and you get this kind of this sort of smell of that starts off really dark blue, kind of like Smurf roadkill, and then you sort of over time it gets really, really light sky blue, kind of like really like a pale sky in the middle of the day sort of thing. It's really, really light blue. I use this similar technique in my Blue Happiness scent that I did for an installation last year. The installation was called The Inner Workings of a Scented Feeling. So I had a scent about happiness that actually was sort of about that kind of blue sky feeling. So that's the heart of the perfume. It's very interesting as well because it is almost kind of as a scent, because of this sort of contrast of kind of floral, kind of wet and damp, kind of masculine with the eucalyptus sort of scent. You get this almost like pansexual thing going on, where it's not feminine, it's not masculine, it's not unisex. It's kind of all of them and none of them at the same time. So then, if you're looking again at the painting, so that blue note is really the heart of it. Then below, there's this really, really interesting sort of smaller section that is, I guess, orange and with a lighter yellowy orange in the middle here, with and on its outskirt is looks almost like an orange pencil, dark orange outline, I guess you would call it. Not great with naming colors, but that section is those sort of 2 parts are a completely different section of the perfume that contains bitter orange oil, clementine oil, which is sort of a little like a lemony sort of scent, really a beautiful like lemon pith without being sour though. Combine that with an amazing oil called South African tangerine oil, which is really like a it's a citrus oil on crack. It's quite unusual, really intense, and that has that raw orange kind of thing, but mixed in with some narcotic floral smells, sorts of verging on green. Very interesting. And sort of blended that together with some orange flower and a tropical flower called champaca, which has a really sweet, almost squeaky kind of nasal sort of sweetness. It's very intense, but I dilute it down and only use a little bit of it. And then if you're looking again at the painting, there is an outline of I guess a kind of almost rosette, deep, dry, grainy kind of red brown. I'd say that's probably as good a description as I'll be able to give that color right now. And I used vetiver, which is a root from India. It's got that incredible cut sort of earth smell, really, really raw and tends to be sort of stoically masculine in its scent. Sort of smells a lot like Winston's, my perfume Winston's. Mix that together with a really beautiful rose oil called Bulgarian Rose, which is in my perfume Black and Deep Red as well, and then put that together with a material called Ambroxan Cetylox, which is sort of a scent. It's a synthetic that smells a little bit like ambergris, which is petrified whale puke, mixed with like a really clean and modern cedarwood smell, really modern masculine cedarwood smell. So that's sort of every part of the perfume described very, very quickly. But really, it's a very minimal, or what I like to call a minimalist, a maximal minimalist perfume. That's it. And It's got less than 15 ingredients in it, which is quite rare for perfume, I think. A lot of perfumes tend to get almost insanely complex with hundreds of different ingredients. This is a really stripped back sort of scent with its bare essentials needed. I think I tend to move. This scent was sort of the beginning of me moving towards a more stripped back approach, I think. So it's hard also when explaining some of this. A lot of people tend to think about perfume as just sort of the combination of the ingredients, but it's really important, and particularly with someone like me who's an independent creative that and who's focused on perfumer as an artist, that if you gave all the materials that I used in this perfume, Blue In Monolithic, to 10 different perfumers, they would use and create something. They would create a perfume out of them with completely different character, style, sort of color. Some would be less blue, some would be more orange, some would emphasize the citrus more, some would emphasize that sort of dark, deeper element more. I think that it's important when we talk about perfume and talk about what's inside perfume, which people really obviously love to know about and connect with deeply, because every scent has its own character, that that we consider that the actual heart of a perfume, what makes it alive, what gives it a soul, is the way that these materials are shaped by the hands and the imagination of the person who's created them, much like how you give 20 different sculptors the same block of marble. They will create something really quite different each time. I think that's something to really keep in mind when I'm talking about some of these works. Maybe poses a little bit of a challenge as well when I talk about how these are created, because they're not just the sum of their ingredients, they're the sum of how I was feeling over the 3 to 4 months of creating this, and how something like these paintings affect someone's psyche and emotional life over the 2 years that I created the 3 perfumes that are inside this series. So that's definitely something to think about. I hope that makes sense. It's not really a foundational, it's more of a sort of like a semi-advanced thing to think about. It requires a little bit of a perception change, I think, a perceptual shift for a lot of people who engage with perfume in traditional ways, I think. But I think it's exciting to think about that, because it opens different doors for not only the perfumers and the people who distribute the perfumes, but for really the world as a whole, I think. Okay, great. I've talked for a lot longer than I thought I would, but I had a lot of fun, and I hope that makes sense. A lot of that was really off the top of my head, and I hope that you guys got something from that talk. And if you have any questions, I'll maybe just wait another minute or two and talk about next week briefly. If you have any questions, feel free to post them down below. If not, that's absolutely fine. I've talked for an hour, so it's quite enough. Again, this will be available on my Facebook page later, and on my YouTube later on as well, maybe next week. Next week, I'm going to talk about Black and Deep Red, and maybe Ira as well. So in the Rothko series, there's Blue In Monolithic, Black and Deep Red, and Ira. I'm going to talk about the Black and Deep Red and Ira next week. Maybe talk a little bit more about some sort of, honestly, we'll just have to wait and see what I talk about. It's going to be a surprise. So we'll see how that goes. And thank you again so much for watching. And if you watch this in the coming months after I filmed it. Thank you so much. And I'm going to leave a little link in the video as well, where you can go to see my Etsy and read about the perfumes. Okay, thanks guys. Have a good week. Bye. Wait.